Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Benson Latin American Collection. I am Melissa Guy, the director of the library, and it is my distinct honor to welcome you here for our program, Before and After Chile 1973, Recovering a More Just Future. Before going any further, I would like to read a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge and honor the present and past relationships of Native American peoples to the lands on which the University of Texas at Austin now stands, including Tonkawas, Lipan Apaches, Comanches, and others extending back millennia. And now I'd like to acknowledge the various institutions and individuals who've made this event possible through both financial and logistical support. I first want to thank the Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice here at UT, especially Karen Engel to my right, the Minerva House Drysdale Regents Chair in Law and co-director of the Rappaport Center, Caroline Hahn, Senior Program Coordinator, Cooper Christensen, Postdoctoral Fellow, and Quinn Olette Cray, Administrative Associate. I'd also like to acknowledge the Native American and Indigenous Studies program at UT, especially Luis Carcamo Echante, Associate Professor of Spanish and Director of NACE, the Latin American Initiative at UT Law, especially Ted McGee and Ariel Dulitsky, Director of the Latin American Initiative, as well as the Human Rights Clinic. The Tereso Long Institute of Latin American Studies, and especially its director, Adela Pineda, and Paloma Diaz, Assistant Director of Programs. And finally, I'd like to thank the entire team at the Benson Latin American Collection. Before I turn things over to Karen, I want to remind everyone that we will have a reception following the program that will take place downstairs in the main reading room of the Benson with plenty of good food from local restaurant Lima Criolla. So please plan on staying after the event. And during the reception, we hope you will take a chance to look at the two exhibits that we have on view at the Benson right now. Both were curated to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the coup. The one that we have up here on this floor is Walls That Speak, Street Art and Activism in Chile, which features street art from the 2019 protests. And downstairs, the exhibit is titled Battle for Chile, Cold War Coup, and the Court of Public Opinion, which provides more of a historical context for the coup. And both of those exhibits are made up entirely of collections that are housed here at the Benson. So again, thank you for coming, and now I will turn things over to Karen.
Thank you, Melissa. And Luis will join us. So good evening. I would like to echo Melissa's thanks to each of the centers and institutions that have been part of planning this discussion today. It has truly been a collaborative event and has benefited from everyone's insights, and you'll see how and why. I especially want to thank my colleague, Luis Carcamo Echante, who has brought his experiences as an activist in Chile during the dictatorship, as well as his scholarly work on Mapuche movements over the years to help formulate the discussion. It's been really important for me as an international human rights law scholar who works on the relationship between social movements and law, including among indigenous and Afro-descendant groups in the Americas, to see this conversation that we've planned among activists, lawyers, and journalists. And I'll just say it also fits with the Rappaport Center's mission to be partners for change at the intersection of academics and advocacy. And even though that's our slogan, I think all of the institutes involved here would adopt that. The most important thanks are reserved for the roundtable participants. It's sort of a round table, a bit of a curve, no table, but who have come, many from quite far away, to be with us today, and who've worked closely with us to make this conversation happen. So let's just give them a preliminary round of applause. Now, as many of you know, September 11, 1973 marked the 50th anniversary of the coup that overthrew Salvador Allende in Chile and was the beginning of a 17-year military dictatorship by Augusto Pinochet with legacies that continue. There have been many events around the world this year, including at UT, to commemorate that anniversary. But we thought we'd do something slightly different today by holding the event in October and using it to cover a broader range of September and October events in or involving Chile that have taken place from 1970 to today, beginning with the election of Allende. And obviously, we don't want to say that this is all of the history of Chile, but it is the contemporary history. And I'm just leaving that slide up for a moment for everybody to sort of take in those dates, and most of which will be talked about by the group. There were some others as well. It was remarkable. Ariel Delitsky found a lot of things that happened in September and October over the years. And we'll keep this up for you all to see. So in planning the event today, we took advantage of the interests of and connections of many different faculty at UT who work in or on Chile. And we came up with a list of people who were all involved in some way using the past to attempt to recover a more just future. And they were people we wanted to be in conversation with each other. And it's kind of amazing. So everyone, each of the centers came up with their top person or persons they wanted, because there are 5 of us and 4 of you, but somehow you all said yes, which is really remarkable. And we very much appreciate that. And we also appreciate that you came here agreeing not to give a speech. So folks wanted to be in dialogue with each other, and we've tried to make that happen for you today. So you can see the names and titles of all of the participants on the next slide, and then we'll come back to this one. But rather than us taking time to introduce them, we thought that we would ask each one of them to tell you a bit about themselves to set the stage for the conversations. That way, within the first few minutes, you will have heard from everyone.
Mari pu Peñi, Mari pu Lamguien, Mari pu Wenui, Mari Compuche, Inche Luis Carcamo Huechante Piñen, Inche Mapuche Huillichenyen. A Mapuche greeting for everyone. Welcome here. Especially welcome to all of our guest speakers for this evening. I'm very grateful to all the members of the co-organizing team, and of course to my dear colleague Karen Engel, with whom we have been working closely to give form to this important conversation, to prepare this important conversation this evening. So I just would like to ask everyone to say a word about your current work and activism and your sense of the importance of memory in it. So we can do it this way then to allow you to introduce each other.
So my name is John Dingus. I'm a professor at Columbia University Emeritus, which means I retired, don't get paid anymore, but I still write. I've written a number of books about Chile. I was there at the time of the coup, and my most recent work is on, some of you may remember the film Missing, about the 2 Americans who were killed right after the military coup in Chile, and my book tells the real story of what happened.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Carola Zuleta, yo soy administradora de la Corporación Parque por la Paz Villa Grimaldi, que es un sitio de memoria, el lugar recuperado por la sociedad civil, donde funcionó el ex cuartel Terranova, donde se instaló el aparato represivo, que es la DINA, y que por varios años después del golpe de Estado se constituyó como un centro secreto de secuestro, tortura y exterminio. Hoy Villa Grimaldi tiene un trabajo importante en recuperar esas memorias trabajar en la pedagogía de la memoria con comunidades educativas, recuperar también documentos y archivos orales de aquellos que estuvieron vinculados al espacio. Eso, muchas gracias.
Hello, my name is Arnulf Becker-Lorca. I'm originally from Chile, but I teach at the European University Institute in Florence, in Italy. And as an international lawyer, I do history of international law. And going immediately to Louis' question, one of the emphases in my work is to think the battles at the intellectual level that Chile has experienced over time, going back to the times of Allende, the times of the coup, and today on the battle over the next constitution, and the role that lawyers have performed in solving those battles for conservative or authoritarian purposes, but also for purposes of emancipation. So we're going to talk about that.
Tauhain kompu lamien mule palo faupule Alina Namunkura Rodenkirchen Tainche. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Alina Namunkura Rodenkirchen. I am Mapuche. I was adopted to Germany, so my first language is German. I am living since, I think, 6 years now, 7 years, in Hualmapu again, in the south of Chile. I am a teacher. I am working at the university and in a Mapuche school on the countryside. I did go back to Chile to recover my life as Mapuche, which I wasn't able to live, and working like in different aspects of revitalization, normally language revitalization. So I learn Mapuzungun, I teach Mapuzungun, and working at the university, teaching the future Mapuzungun professors how strategies how to teach Mapuzungun.
Hi, my name is Maria Daimar, and I am okay. So I am representing two organizations today. One is called chileadoption.se because it's an organization for adoptees from Chile living in Sweden. I'm also representing a Chilean organization called Hijos y Madres de Silencio, and this is about reuniting families of disappeared children, because during both during the dictatorship and afterwards, many children were stolen, abducted, and sent abroad. So I'm here to give them a voice and also our mothers. Thank you for having me.
All right. I think we have enough microphones so you all can keep that down there. And if you need water, also, we have water. So if we can have the slides back up of the timeline, we'll start at the beginning. And then we're going to be here for 3 days. So settle in. So we thought we'd start with John Dingus, because you were in Chile. You went to Chile in 1972. And you said you didn't go just as any journalist. You went as an internationalist who very much believed in the democratic revolution. So can you start us off by talking a little bit more about what attracted you that way?
Well, thanks a lot. It's a great honor to be at the University of Texas. I've been here a number of times, but today I actually got a chance to get in the archives, and I found some great stuff for my new book. So I'm in paradise. I've been working on Chile for many, many years, starting really in 1972. I went as a correspondent. I was a very young in terms of experience. I was actually 29 years old, but I had 2 years experience as a journalist, as a police reporter. I wanted to become a foreign correspondent, so I went to Chile. Why? Chile was the most important story in Latin America. I went there with my idealism intact. 1972 is still the time of great social upheaval. We called it the movement in the United States, mainly around the civil rights movement, followed by the anti-war movement. Chile then was the next step, certainly in my life. I have 5 minutes, I only have 4 left, to tell you about the Allende government. And that's a great challenge because you really have to say, what was the bottom line? We've all heard about this. So here are my thoughts. I want to talk about, in these 4 minutes, accomplishments, goals, and failures of the Unidad Popular, the popular unity. The word that comes to mind from my experience, and I arrived for the last year of Allende and stayed for 5 years more during the dictatorship, is the word dignity. I want you to think about the experience of the Chile experience, not in terms of politics, but in terms of the people. That was where the experience was most vital. The people recovered their dignity, perhaps a dignity they had never had. The programs of the Unidad Popular were redistribution of income, wages were raised, land was redistributed, health and nutrition spending increased. As a result, Chileans ate better, lived better than they ever had in their lives, certainly those at the lower half of the income distribution. In culture, the word I would choose is joy and fun and freedom. And I know that the right wing tells a very different story. It was the freest place I had ever been, and more fun than the United States at the time. We did trabajo voluntario, voluntary work. Books were cheap. You could buy a Hemingway book on the translation for a dime. Music and theater was brought out to the poblaciones, to the poor people's areas. It was a wonderful place. This was what Allende wanted to bring. The mainstream of Chileans were brought into the cultural, intellectual life and the political life of the country. The goals were gigantic. Socialism in democracy, pluralism, and liberty. It had never been tried before. No Marxist government had ever come to power by elections. No Marxist government had ever come to power repudiating the Leninist principle of dictatorship or the proletariat. One of the reasons the United States opposed it, but I'll get to that later. Democracy was not a tactic. It was not a throwaway for the Allende government. It was the foundation. But not all of the Allende government agreed with what is the value of democracy. And I'm not going to talk about the economy, but that's a big area. The failures, but I do want to spend a little time on the failures. Never before, the government of the Unidad Popular never achieved a majority. And so they were trying to operate in a democratic environment without parliamentary majority or even a majority in the election for the presidency. Political polarization was the most important failure of the Unidad Popular. They were unable to keep the unity of the various parties. Some of them were Marxist, some of them were centrist. They fought among themselves and were not able to consolidate a unified response to the right-wing offensive against them and against the United States opposition that was brought to bear against them in the international forum. So that's very resumidamente, right? That is the experience of the Unidad Popular, and we'll go on from there.
Thank you, John. Now, Alina Namankura Rodenkirchen Lamgen, hermana. So, as you know, and as many of us know, a sort of important process in regard to land reform did start in Chile in 1962, the agrarian reform. And that process even became deepened during the times of Allende. So how did the Mapuche people relate to agrarian reform before and during the Allende periods? What was the role of the Mapuche land back movement at the time, specifically organizations such as the Movimiento Campesino Revolucionario or others in these land struggles, Lamien?
So we are now speaking like in a context of land loss, usurpation because of the colonization. And these agrarian reforms were kind of seen by Mapuche people from their perspective as an act of justice, as a reparation, and to re-articulate their communities, which is in Mapuzungun, lof, to re-articulate the lof, which came in 71 to a phenomenon that was called cautinazo, where 300,000 hectares were recovered. And this was on the one hand like the active recuperation of land by Mapuche people, but on the other hand, the CORA, the Corporation of the Agrarian Reform, they came to Mapuche people as well and said, well, there's a land like in the neighborhood and nobody is working on this land, so do you want to work on this land? And so the community said, yes, we are going to work it, we are going to make it work. And these are like these two dynamics, the cautinazo, the recuperation, the active recuperation, and then the CORA asking Mapuche to get this. But there's one condition that until now the left wing is still not understanding about us. I always said we are pre-Marx, we are pre all the ideologies, because we are like millions of years is our history. So all these ideas of class fight, we can't relate to this, because this is something that don't apply to us. But we have been looked as, and the dynamics of the land recuperation, as something that was into this class fight, like the oppressed campesinos, oppressed obreros. But we have singularities as a society. We have our own aspiration in a political, social, cultural, spiritual sense. So the left wing, I think until now, it's still not really getting it, what we want, and that we try to articulate to get back to our former structures. And well, the MIR, the MCR, in this case, they were like a tool for us to achieve our love again, to get back our land. And I have a number from the 688 lands that were given during the agrarian reform to the people. Only 20% went to the Mapuche families, or to reduction or reservations, how it's called here. So it was it was not equilibrado between like the Chilean campesinos and the Mapuche people. I made an investigation about the experiences of Mapuche in dictatorship. I talk mostly with Mapuche who were active in the left-wing party or in the land recuperation movement. And a lot of them told me, we as Mapuche, the left used us to decorate their speeches. But in the political movement, we weren't in the positions to define or choose the strategies. And this we can see until now, unfortunately. This is until now, but there's a consensus as well, belong Mapuche people, that the time of Allende was, I think, the only time for us inside of the Chilean system where there was like an attempt to get more rights for us. So this was the direction of all the people I talked to, but always with these ideas that these political party never really got our ideas, but until now they try to use us to be more intercultural or to get representation from us.
Thank you so much. We'll turn to the lawyer now. So Arnulf, this will just be just for a couple of minutes, but do you want to say something about law in the times of Allende and maybe in relationship to agrarian reform, joy, whatever you like?
So I'll try to connect it to what Alina was talking. So I think it is important to understand that the Popular Unity, Unidad Popular, was a culmination of a 20th century project, in the sense that if historians talk about an oligarchic Chile in the late 19th century, there's a long process of transformation, social transformation, that started in the 20th century by recognizing the worker as a social subject, and then continued with land reform towards the 1950s, 60s, and 70s to the recognition of el campesino, the peasant. And I think there were, which is important for today, and we're going to talk about that later, in the sense of the constitutional moment that Chile lives. During Allende, during the Allende period, there was a draft circulated of a new constitution, so an attempt to change the constitution, that had indigenous people's rights. So it would recognize the Mapuche people and the Rapa Nui. So I agree with Alina that there was no, from the left, there was no direct discourse to extend from worker to peasant to the indigenous people, but the seeds were there. Now, in 30 seconds before I finish that, as John mentioned, the project was getting to socialism democratically, which meant that not only to respect the outcomes of elections, but also to respect the rule of law. So lawyers during the Allende period faced, so there's a long story, but if we can concentrate on one aspect, they faced the challenge of getting the program with which Allende was elected passed during those years, so implementing it regardless of the fact that they lost the parliamentary election, so that they had Congress against them. And they decided that they would go forward respecting the existing law. How did they do that? There were legal thinkers back then that thought that in the process I mentioned before of social transformations throughout the 20th century, there were previous laws that were used in that process that could be used explicitly for expropriation and land reform. And that were called the resquicios legales, the legal loopholes, that very interestingly were used then to justify the coup. So there was a battle over how to understand a government, the use of legal thinking by a government that wants to use social transformation, and what are the limits in that process that then were used by lawyers who justified the coup, justifying the legality of the Allende project because of the loopholes, and I'm going to explain that later in the next round.
Thank you, Arnulf. So we were in extraordinary times in the Chile of the early 1970s, the times politically, economically, socially, and culturally of a deep and massive sense of dignity, as well as hope for justice and change. So then this process was violently interrupted on September 11th, 1973. John, since you were there at the time, can you tell us about the day of the coup d'etat? Also, what sense do you have of the role of the United States then and in the subsequent years?
Okay. I'm going to read the most important thing that occurred to me on September 11th, 1973. I was in my house. My girlfriend went to her classes, came running back and said, "I think the coup has started." We turned on the radio, and at 9:30 approximately, we heard Allende's last speech. And I'm going to read from that speech. Siempre estaré junto a ustedes. Por lo menos mi recuerdo será de un hombre digno que fue leal con la patria. Trabajadores de mi patria, tengo fe en Chile y su destino. Superarán otros hombres este momento gris y amargo en el que la traición pretende imponerse. Siguen ustedes sabiendo que mucho más temprano que tarde, de nuevo abrirán las grandes alamedas por donde pase el hombre y la mujer libre para construir una sociedad mejor. Viven los trabajadores. That was an amazing moment that is repeated over and over, and I just wanted you to hear that in its emotional power as well as its, I don't know what it meant politically. He did not call for resistance. He did not mention the political parties in that last speech. And of course, he hinted to what happened later, which is that he killed himself. He would not submit himself to the military. But many of us thought that resistance was possible. The word was that you should go to the factories in what was called the cordones industriales, the factories that had been taken over and were being run by the workers. This was the real revolution, really. The campesinos in the agrarian reform and the workers in the cordones industriales. This was the heart of the revolution for the people. Going to the factories by foot, we wanted to see, I went with some of my friends, I wanted to see if there really was going to be resistance. We went to the Luchetti factory, which makes fideos, means noodles. There was no resistance. They said, go home, nothing is happening. But later on, in my most recent book, I interviewed other workers in other factories, the former ITT factory, a textile factory, and a factory called Sumar. There was an attempt at resistance. There were some weapons, particularly at Sumar, but it was quickly squashed. They were waiting for weapons that never came. The loss of hope for the workers is hard to capture unless you went through it and suffered it yourself. It lasted, I think, for two generations. And it is, I think, the reason that politics is so divided and so there's so much disengagement from politics even today because of that great disappointment. We put everything into the experiment of the popular unity, and it was smashed. People took decades to recover their hope that they could do something again. Hopefully that is now what is happening. the U.S. role, 1970 and 1973, the United States organized a coup in 1970. They did not organize the coup in 1973. It's important to keep that distinction. In 1970, to attempt to keep Allende from being inaugurated, they launched a coup with military officers who recruited young right-wing pijes, right-wing kids who were rich, who got guns and tried to kidnap the head of the armed forces. And in the process, they assassinated him. So imagine, they assassinated the head of the armed forces in order to provoke a coup. It did not work, and Allende was able to be inaugurated. That was what Henry Kissinger and his people put in motion. In 1973, the military coup was encouraged by the United States. It was welcomed and applauded by the United States, and for years, the United States defended the military government against international criticism, despite the rampant human rights abuses that were, for which Chile has become a symbol in human rights law, in human rights organization. There is one final element of the U.S. role that nobody really talks about much until recently, and that is that in 1985 to 1990, the United States actually participated in helping Chile return to democracy. While $7 million was invested in Chile to foment the coup in 1973, $2 million was invested to support the campaign of no in 1988. So the United States came around at the very end to be on the side of the angels in Chile. It's important to see this. This is our country. These are the complexities that we have, a country that does a lot of bad things and sometimes some good things.
Gracias, gracias John. Me gustaría ahora hacerle una pregunta o algunas preguntas a Carola Zuleta. Muchos historiadores e historiadoras del periodo señalan que quizás la fase represiva más intensa y dura de la dictadura cívico-militar encabezada por Pinochet ocurre entre 1973 y 1979, y precisamente en este periodo tuvo un rol importante el cuartel Terranova, en que se va luego a establecer el memorial o el sitio de memoria que tú diriges, que es el Parque por la Paz Villa Grimaldi. ¿En qué sentido lo que ocurrió allí en el cuartel Terranova fue un reflejo de lo que estaba aconteciendo en Chile durante todo ese periodo tras el golpe militar y fines de los 70? ¿Y por qué y cómo se cerró finalmente ese lugar?
Bueno, hay un primer periodo represivo justo después del golpe que tiene ciertas características, que tiene que ver con justamente reprimir estos cordones industriales, donde los lugares que son centro de secuestro son en general los estadios. La época en que lamentable y trágicamente el Estadio Nacional de Chile se vuelve un gran campo de concentración. Lo mismo el Estadio Chile, ahora Estadio Víctor Jara, que de hecho a los pocos días del golpe de Estado asesinan a Víctor Jara en el Estadio Chile. Y tiene otras características este primer momento represivo. Luego viene todo este momento de estos centros secretos, porque de hecho a los estadios iban, de hecho la familia, y se ponían afuera a pedir explicaciones por sus familiares. Pero empezaron a aparecer estos espacios como Villa Grimaldi, hay más, lamentablemente en mi país. Villa Grimaldi es icónico porque ahí se instala lo que se llamaba el cuartel Terranova, donde se instala la Brigada de Inteligencia Metropolitana, que es el brazo operativo de la DINA. Y ahí se instala Manuel Contreras, Krasnov Marchenko, Moren Brito, que fueron, bueno, al día de hoy, nombres de los personajes más brutales de la represión se instalan especialmente en Villa Grimaldi, porque Villa Grimaldi, el lugar donde está situado es en Peñalolén, un lugar que no había tanta urbanización como hay al día de hoy, donde tenían un aeródromo al frente, lo que se vincula y dialoga horrorosamente con lo que fueron los vuelos de la muerte. Y se abren estos lugares, que Villa Grimaldi es muy simbólico porque son centros secretos. Acá no sabían dónde eran llevados, los familiares no sabían dónde estaban estas personas, no sabías por cuánto tiempo ibas a estar, ni de qué se te acusaba. Solo escuchabas y vivías la tortura desde el momento en que entrabas a Villa Grimaldi y eras despojado de tu humanidad, en la medida en que no se consideraba ni tu nombre, se te asignaba un número, ibas a un tipo de celda, eras sacado solo para torturas y mientras estabas ahí escuchabas la tortura de otras personas, los gritos, y reconocías compañeros, porque en especial Villa Grimaldi, a diferencia de estos primeros centros, se perseguía sí el compromiso político. A Villa Grimaldi sí iban militancias. Es distinto al barrio del cordón industrial, porque estos espacios, de hecho nosotros en Villa Grimaldi hay memoriales a los partidos políticos. Es un lugar que sí rinde, porque sí rinde este homenaje, porque sí era gente comprometida, en muchos a favor y que trabajan activamente dentro de los partidos políticos que apoyaron la Unidad Popular. Y también, bueno, el MIR, que si bien no estaba dentro de la Unidad Popular, pues quería otro ritmo hacia el sueño revolucionario tenía el mirismo, pero también cae ahí en gran parte el mirismo. Entonces tienen estas características que buscan militancia y en la tortura lograr llegar a otros militantes. Y la pregunta repetida siempre, ¿dónde están las armas? Y no habían armas. Entonces, por eso Villa Grimaldi tiene esta como connotación, esta importancia. Lamentablemente, la mayoría de los asesinados, de los crímenes en Villa Grimaldi son categoría de detenidos desaparecidos. La mayoría son detenidos desaparecidos y muy poquitos ejecutados políticos. A propósito de lo que yo mencionaba, que en Villa Grimaldi, como está frente al aeródromo de Tobalaba, el procedimiento muy parecido también a lo que se hacía en Argentina, tiene que ver con los vuelos de la muerte, que ya han sido investigados, que ya hay antecedentes como el prisionero, en el caso chileno, era lanzado en general al mar, amarrado a un riel y puesto en un saco y muchas veces adormecido con el pentotal, un tipo de narcótico que adormecía, pero en muchos casos los prisioneros estaban despiertos y estaban absolutamente conscientes de lo que estaban viviendo. Nosotros en Villa Grimaldi al día de hoy tenemos la muestra de estos rieles de la Bahía de Quintero, que es una donación que hizo el juez Juan Guzmán a la corporación, que es un juez que trabajó mucho el tema de las desapariciones forzadas una vez que retomamos la democracia o la postdictadura, y que entregó en comodato para poner en valor para el área de museo, que es una de las áreas que tenemos en Villa Grimaldi, y como material para terminar este relato que hacemos una vez que uno entra a Villa Grimaldi. Eso es.
Gracias, Carola. So I'd like to turn to Alina and Maria now, and ask you all to talk about some of the many ways in which the Mapuche were affected during the dictatorship. And I thought it'd be good to start off, actually just have Alina continue the story about Mapuche involvement in land recuperation and what happened during the dictatorship in terms of both the civil and political rights of those who were involved, as well as the larger issue in terms of land dispossession. And then we'll have Maria talk more about the adopted children.
Yes, so in my study, I talked to Mapuche activists who were active in the political movement. But I have to say that most of the victims of persecution weren't politically active. So we have to say that there was a racist component in this persecution. There was a brutal repression, and because of these different aspects that intervene, because all of Mapuche was seen as leftists, they are all communists, socialists. But there was a persecution and like a rejection because Mapuche are poor, this was the idea, and because they are Mapuche. So these are those three elements that are like intervening in this repression. The people I talked to, they experienced torture, exile for many years. In my years I lived in Germany, I knew a lot of Mapuche exile people who are living in the Netherlands, Belgium, and they were part of my own journey to recover my Mapucheness, Tani Mapuchingen, and they are not, or they have not necessarily be part of like the left project. Nowadays in the studies, they talk about that they were the cannon fodder for the leftist parties. Because this persecution was brutal against the communities, there were the Ruka, the Mapuche houses, were put on fire. At night, there were raids, tear gas, and like the stories we hear, as well as for the Chileans, that maybe they got the Mapuche, they hang them out of the helicopters and things like that. And where the dictatorship, it's kind of a second stroke, it's a second hit for Mapuche people after colonization. And with this racial component, because Chileans say, well, we may be poor, but we are not Mapuche. So this is unfortunately like the way people thought, or I don't know, maybe think still. But this is kind of the way like this they saw down to us, or maybe until now, I don't know. And well, all this persecution, which came later on to torture, exile, I would like to say something about this, because the repression for us did not stop. The repression, for example, when we talked today about situations where the children lived experiences about tear gas, arrest rates, we still experience this in some communities. It's not that it has stopped. It's not that we still can live in peace. The situation is still going on, so we can't say nunca jamás, because there's no stop for us in this case. And for example, because of land deposition, it's still a huge problem. Where I live in Temuco, still the municipality is still trying to get more land, and we, like the Mapuche communities there, are like they wrote it in the newspaper, it's a suicidal ring of Temuco, because Temuco can't grow, because we are there living on the land and they can't grow. So, but there's another element, because when we talk about forced disappearance, the registered Mapuche are 137. But when I ask the people, many didn't want to give testimony at Walich or Rettig. So we don't know what's the real number. And there's another issue, because there have been 20 to 25,000 children in this time of the dictatorship who were abducted to Germany, United States, Switzerland, Sweden. And this is another kind of forced disappearance, and nobody is talking about. And so I will give now to Maria to talk about this.
I just continue. Okay. So I think I need to go over there. So like Elina mentioned, so like we know that 20 to 25,000 children was adopted and displaced from Chile, outside Chile. And I'm going to give examples from Sweden mostly, but there are people here in the US, Canada, Italy, and so on. So what I wanted to say is that we talk about adopted children. So I was never adopted. I was abducted from my mom, from my family, in the delivery room in Lautaro in 1975. I left Chile with a decision from the court of custody. I was going to go to Sweden from Chile, and in Sweden I was adopted, but not in Chile. So in Chile I still exist. I have an address in Lautaro. And I'm also, I just took my documents for an example, but we're talking about thousands of children. But at the point where I was leaving Chile, they issued a passport, and according to this passport, I am living in Rancagua, a city like 1 hour from Santiago. And my birth certificate says that I live in Lautaro. And then I have another document that says I live in Santiago. So 3 different addresses, just to give an example. And like I said, I represent 2 organizations, and I think the name Hijos y Madres de Silencio says a lot, because you haven't been talking about those children that disappeared, or the mothers that are mothers without children, childless mothers. And even though I took from a paper here from 1975, they were talking about this traffic of children, or children that disappeared, but nothing happened. And we were accepted into different countries around the world, as I said before. And just also to give an example, the year I left Chile, 1975, it was 97 children that left from Chile to Sweden, only to Sweden. And then the year after, it was the double amount. So it was about 200 children that left Chile to Sweden. And what we know in Sweden, there are about 2,200 children. And now, like you see me, I'm almost 50 years old now. And we think that about half of us, we come from Temuco, from the Temuco area. We are Mapuche children. But I didn't find out that I was Mapuche until I think 4 years ago. So I just always thought I was from Chile, and Sweden is so far away. So you don't talk about race or that you are from a certain group. So that is something I found out 4 years ago. And it's not only about me. I left Chile with a Swedish name. I was already named Ingegerd Maria Olsson Karlsson, very Swedish name. So we have a lot of consequences of how we left Chile. So I'm not, like Elina, I think, we are not counted in as part of the Mapuche people, because we disappeared. And yeah, I think we're going to continue to later. So, thank you.
Thank you both, and just for continuing the discussion there. So now I'm realizing there's a pattern here. I'm going to the lawyer. So this is, again, we're in 1973 to 1980. And Arnold, if you've written about the ongoing authoritarian legacies of the institutionalization of the political, economic, and social reforms that were implemented during the dictatorship, and you already started to suggest some of that for us. Can you just talk a little bit more about what role law, including the 1980 Constitution, played in that institutionalization?
Mm-hmm. So, for those who are not that familiar with the Chilean experience, the coup in that sense was a foundational moment. So, as I was explaining before, there was a battle over interpretation, to what extent the policies of Allende were constitutional and legal. So there was an argument that they were, and therefore the coup it was not only violent, but also was foundational. So it was the violence that was described before was violent not only just to repress, but it was to recreate the state in a way that was a explicit rejection of the process of social change that had happened before. So then lawyers played a very crucial role in explaining and justifying the coup as a legal. So as a legal coup. The idea was that the Allende government had become not unconstitutional, and therefore the action by the military was legal action in order to recover the freedoms that the Allende government had violated. Mainly property. So it was a property justification that was one of the most important for the coup. So there is a moment where these justifications were not only discursive, but are ingrained in the new constitution of the time, which is the 1980s constitution, which is still the constitution of Chile as today, 2023. So what did this constitution institutionalize? I think first politically, it was a Cold War anti-communist constitution that had to, again, it was a rejection of the trajectory I was describing before. So if the 20th century was a process where workers were recognized with rights, the urban poor and the campesino, the peasants, were recognized. This constitution was undoing that, undoing the democratic process of deepening, was undoing by outlawing the Communist Party, having special representation for the military in Congress, etc. It was, so politically was conservative. It was also conservative culturally. So there was, the church was split, the Catholic Church, between those who were active in the human rights struggle, but the other half of the church was very conservative, justified the coup, and was very present in the drafting process. So the 1980s Constitution recognized the civil society, not as social movements, but civil society that had a role to play in as the private sector, and as guaranteeing that the state should be small and limited power. And third, I think, was economically mostly neoliberal, because one forgets, or many people forget, that the greatest privatizations happened during the transition rather than during the dictatorship. So the dictatorship was relatively neoliberal, but neoliberalism was really implemented after. But the constitution was crucial in not having social and economic rights, and having rights, constitutional rights, that would guarantee freedom to choose. So social services, or from health to pensions, etc., were constitutionalized as rights to access provided by private actors. And this is more or less the structure of the Chilean state until today.
Please allow me to come back to Chile in the late 1970s through my personal and collective memories of the time. As an adolescent who was like in my 14 or 15 years old in the late 1970s, I did start hearing about human rights violations in Chile while finishing high school. In 1980, it was the approval of the Constitution of 1980 as was described by Arnold. And I remember that time because I was in my first year in college at the Universidad Austral de Chile, Valdivia, in southern Chile, at the Southern University of Chile, in the city of Valdivia, in southern Chile, as a Mapuche Huilliche kid moving from a rural community to the city to do college. So I remember that we did march at that time against the Constitution on campus, and we were only 20 students out there surrounded by a lot of cameras from probably the secret police of Pinochet, photographic cameras. So then the dictatorship underwent a sort of a severe economic crisis between 1972 and 1983. Unemployment exponentially rose up in the country. It became a major issue, the issue of unemployment in Chile, as well as the dramatic impoverishment of many, many people in Chile. And in addition to the human rights issues, the socioeconomic issues became very, very pervasive in the public conversation in the country. So this paved the way for a lot of massive discontent in the country. And it was a different time for those who were trying to build resistance against the dictatorship at the time. I remember that then we were like 300 students marching from campus to the main park of the city of Valdivia to join the first major national protest in the country on May 11, 1983. And thousands of people throughout Chile got to the street to start open public protests against the dictatorship. And this was the first half of the 1980s. So, and this also paved the way for what was going to become the final critical moment for Pinochet's regime, October 5th, 1988, when the plebiscite no and yes, or yes to Pinochet took place. And that's when the no to the continuity of the Pinochet regime won with 56% of the votes. So those were the 1980s, and we are now fast forward 33 years ahead to talk about some of the ways that Pinochet's legacies have lived for many, many, many additional years, even today, and also how activists, lawyers, and historians have attempted to respond to the years of the dictatorship, as well as its many lasting legacies. So we would like now to ask Carola, Arnulf, and Maria to talk about that, as well as about horizons they may see toward historical justice. Carola, tú has dicho en una entrevista, el Parque por la Paz Villa Grimaldi constituye un símbolo por sí mismo. Su proyección nacional e internacional resulta clave para la lucha por un mundo en donde los derechos humanos sean un imperativo y la memoria un patrimonio al que las distintas generaciones deben tener acceso. ¿Puedes hablarnos esta tarde acerca del proyecto de crear el Parque por la Paz Villa Grimaldi? ¿Cuándo fue establecido? ¿Cuál fue su propósito? ¿Cómo ha ido cambiando a través del tiempo? ¿Cuáles son parte de los éxitos que ha tenido este esfuerzo de hacer memoria? Pero también las limitaciones, no solo del trabajo del Parque por la Paz Villa Grimaldi, sino también las limitaciones de las políticas en Chile de crear espacios institucionales de memoria. Esa sería la pregunta que tiene al menos otras más.
Sí. Bueno, Villa Grimaldi tiene la particularidad de ser el primer sitio recuperado en toda Latinoamérica. El primer sitio que se recupera es Villa Grimaldi. Como corporación, el trabajo que hemos realizado ya tiene 26 años, lo que para sitios de memoria es bastante. Inicialmente, cuando se recupera, yo destaco mucho que la recuperación es desde la sociedad civil. Acá no hay una política pública en estos momentos de la historia de Chile postdictadura desde el Estado recuperar estos espacios. Acá se moviliza la ciudadanía, una organización muy importante que se llamaba la Asamblea Permanente de Derechos Humanos de la Reina y Peñalolén, que eran los vecinos. Se movilizan los familiares, los sobrevivientes de Villa Grimaldi y grupos ligados a la Iglesia Católica. Es muy fuerte la imagen de José Aldunate, un sacerdote jesuita que lidera mucho la recuperación de Villa Grimaldi. Haciendo ese primer alcance de que se recupera desde la sociedad civil. Luego viene el debate, ¿qué se hace con este espacio? En ese intertanto se hace la declaratoria, Villa Grimaldi tiene calidad de monumento nacional, por lo tanto es de bienes nacionales en Chile, y está en comodato a la Corporación Parque por la Paz Villa Grimaldi, que es una institución de derecho privado sin fines de lucro, que tiene una asamblea de socios. Entonces ahí se da el primer debate, ¿qué se hace con este lugar? Porque antes de recuperar Villa Grimaldi, como otros lugares como parecidos a Villa Grimaldi, se intentó borrar, se intentó blanquear. Y el último director de la CNI, Hugo Salas Benzer, vende este terreno fraudulentamente a un primo para construir en Villa Grimaldi un condominio. Por eso la ciudadanía se mueve con tanta fuerza y asertivamente en el tiempo que logra recuperar Villa Grimaldi, pero ya habían entrado maquinaria. Y, por ejemplo, la casona principal de Villa Grimaldi, cuando se recupera, es escombro. Por lo tanto, la primera discusión es qué hacemos acá. Y qué modelos de espacios de memoria teníamos. Nosotros en ese momento, la primera como inspiración fue algo parecido a Auschwitz-Birkenau. Pero acá no había el espacio, no estaba el edificio. Había una capa de memoria que era, acá quisieron blanquear. Respetamos esta capa de memoria y mostramos los trozos de azulejo, los transformamos en una obra que está en una de las puertas del Villa Grimaldi, un portón cerrado a perpetuidad, en simbolismo del nunca más, y ahí quedan todos estos trozos que se encuentran. Pero claro, la discusión es, bueno, acá armamos la estructura y hacemos el museo del horror en el fondo. ¿Cuál es nuestra discusión? ¿Con quiénes vamos a dialogar? ¿A quiénes queremos acoger? Porque entender que esta comunidad no ha encontrado los cuerpos de las personas amadas. Entender Villa Grimaldi un lugar que no los revictimice, que los acoja, que les dé un lugar de memoria, un lugar de conciencia también nacional para todas las generaciones, que la cuña que tomaste, pero que también sea un lugar que abrace a las víctimas, porque son víctimas que hasta el día de hoy buscan verdad, justicia, y que en muchos casos no han tenido ninguna de ambas. Entonces, como uno de los pilares de lo que para nosotros como chilenos importante es la memoria, la verdad y la justicia. Y esto, emplazarse como este espacio de memoria y pedirle al Estado como un deber del Estado, porque para la ciudadanía es un derecho. Yo tengo el derecho de la memoria, tengo el derecho de acceder, y eso de hecho estaba en esta propuesta constitucional que hizo la Asamblea, el derecho a la memoria y el deber del Estado a recordar, como base para no repetir. Villa Grimaldi es un lugar de conciencia, es un lugar que recuerda, pero es un lugar que debe contribuir a nivel educativo a las nuevas generaciones para no repetir la historia. Y lamentablemente el Estado, en estos casos, como les decía, somos sociedad civil, que accedemos a un apoyo que está en discusión año a año en el Congreso. Tampoco hay una ley que proteja estos espacios, a diferencia, por ejemplo, en los sitios como en Argentina, que un trabajador de un sitio de memoria es un funcionario público. Acá no, acá somos sociedad civil, movilizada, muy apasionada con la causa de derechos humanos, pero que año a año podemos recibir recortes o podemos terminar un año sin, por ejemplo, apoyo económico. ¿Y qué se hace con estos lugares tan importantes a nivel internacional, como referentes internacionales? Estos lugares que nos recuerdan a nivel de conciencia. Bueno, son parte de los desafíos, son parte de las cosas que nos enfrentamos año a año y que ojalá en la discusión interna en algún momento, porque perdimos este momento constituyente, se den a nivel de ley de sitios de memoria probablemente.
Gracias, Carola. So if institutional memory has been one way of responding, and starting maybe a little bit earlier and continuing over time, another has been to think about a new constitution. And there are really three, I don't know if they're all up there, but at least two of them are three new, or the three most recent anniversaries. One would be the fall of 2019, the beginning of the street protests that part of the exhibition is about here. And then in October 2020, voters overwhelmingly, over 70%, I think, voted to have a new constitutional process and elected representatives to the Constitutional Assembly. And then in fall 2022, it was rejected by also a very large number of the voters. Arnulf, you were living in the US at the time and had not been in Chile, had not been living there for a couple of decades, but you decided to get back involved specifically around the constitutional process. So what made you decide to do that? And can you tell us a bit about what your hopes were and maybe your aspirations for deinstitutionalization, and then reflect a little bit on what we might learn from the failure of the draft?
I wouldn't say failure.
The failure to win the in the
I'm
referendum.
just joking. It's not okay. So let me start super briefly. I was a legal advisor. I think all the credit should go to the constituents because of the work that they did and the prices they are paying now because of the backlash against the constituents. So I want to go back to my previous questions in order to make us think the role that legal language has had in Chilean history. So it was crucial during the Allende period that the process of social transformation had to be democratic and legal. Then the coup came, and for the military and the classes that supported the coup, it was crucial to justify it legally and institutionalize the new state that came with the coup in a constitution that is still our constitution. And therefore, for those who were not satisfied with the post-dictatorship or the transition or the new democracy, also thinking about the problems in Chile in constitutional terms was understandable in light of this trajectory. Now, John interestingly mentioned dignity as something that was important during the Allende period. Probably dignity was one of the most important banners during the social uprising during this year. So the idea was that among different groups in society, so students, teachers, etc., there were environmentalists, women. Each of them had their own demands or their own reasons to criticize the Chile of 2019, but all came together on dignity as one of the most important slogans, because there's the perception that the neoliberal society in which we live is one that, although has improved in economic terms, poverty has decreased, etc. There's something about the interpersonal relations and group relations that do not recognize the dignity. So now I would want to connect it what I said before about the 20th century. So if the 19th century was an oligarchic society, as historians have described it, and the 20th century was the process of expansion on inclusion from workers to peasants, etc. The estallido social was a reaction and a hope of and a demand of inclusion. So inclusion now of indigenous peoples, explicit inclusion, sexual diversities, the inclusion of children, the inclusion of again the popular actors, the peasants, etc. And I think that that spirit was present in the Constitutional Assembly, and it was institutionalized. So it was then criticized, etc. But there is an explosion of rights. So there is an explosion. So there's a, you know it, it's Patricia Williams' Alchemy of Rights. Her idea is there. So give rights to everyone. Give rights to nature, to children, to the gender diverse, neurodivergences, rights for the internet, privacy, etc. So there's this explosion of rights. As I think that people were sublimating this 50 years history, going back to moments where the law was used to justify repression and dictatorship. Now, one thing, so if there is a theme here around the Mapuche people and indigenous people in general, plurinationality was one of the ways in which that spirit was translated. And I think in 0 minutes that I have left, I think it played a significant role in the rejection. So the idea was, I was saying that it was a failure. I don't think it was a failure, it was a defeat. And I think this text will haunt us until we do not, we as a people, I'm referring, do not digest and deliberate this text. So I think the current constitutional draft that is now being drafted by political parties rather than by social movements as the first one, probably will be defeated. I hope it will be defeated. Probably will be defeated, and I think that will allow the Chilean people, us, to really deliberate the text and really deliberate why is it that to so many plurinationality is still something to fear and goes back to your internal racism. Why is it that the elite in Chile still thinks about itself as a white elite rather than mixed or rather than as a people with different nationalities? Why is it that this proliferation of rights was used, and with this I promise I finish. Why is it that again the legal profession had a fundamental role in discrediting the draft? So the draft was defeated with the constitutional law and the legal profession in general describing this as un bodrio, a text, un mamarracho. They described, how do you translate mamarracho? The translator, mamarracho? piece of jerk. So legal law professionals, law professors describe this as a mamarracho, as something that would not be recognized as a legal text. And I think what is behind that is the things that we were mentioned before. So an elite that still thinks about itself as white, an elite that doesn't recognize Chile as a country that has a history in colonialism, and also a country that is still haunted by the coup. And this text is so difficult for us because we have to come to terms with our internal colonialism, our internal classism, our internal racism, and our justification of the coup. So the coup was not, in that was different from other coups around the world. It was a foundational coup. It's part of our identity. And that's why probably was naive to think that this could be passed, because what came after the Constitutional Convention is a text that is too difficult to digest for the Chilean people. And I think that's why I don't think it's a failure, it's a starting. The battle is starting again to interpret.
Thank you, Arnold. Ulamgien, Alina, Maria, we know that for the Mapuche people, we are not only haunted by the coup, by Pinochet years, but we are haunted by the very nation-state formation in Chile as an expression of colonialism upon native lands. This was this historical situation worsened during the times of Pinochet in terms of land dispossession. And then, as we know, in 1979, there was a law decree that was instituted in Chile that allowed the corporate forestry industry to cultivate massive radiata pine and eucalyptus tree plantations over native lands. And that has deepened the process of land dispossession against the Mapuche people, against our native lands, bringing ecological destruction in the whole area of what is today known as southern Chile. So then we have land dispossession, but also we have identity dispossession as Mapuche people, as we have learned from you today. So this is a question for Maria. If you tell us a little more about the organizations to which you belong, and especially the ways in which you are using your local and transnational work to pursue both individual and collective justice. And if you can elaborate also a little more about the broader struggle of the Mapuche people in this process.
Okay, so I think I'm going to need a little bit of help from Alina also. So, but if I start about the struggle, so as I tried to describe with earlier, is like my identity and so many others, and I was talking about thousands of other people. So our identities were stolen. So, and I had no idea that I was stolen until I was an adult. And today, together with the two organizations I work with in Chile and in Sweden, we realized like the first thing we have to do, the good thing is, okay, the good thing is in Chile, it's an ongoing crime investigation. They're investigating crimes that children disappeared, and they call it like illegal adoptions. So a good thing is that people that are adopted, they can send their documents to this investigation. And also a parliamentary investigation has been made, but they have made a lot of promises. They wanted, according to this, like, what do you call it, like final paper from the investigation, they decided that they wanted to give, like, us, as Mapuche people, our rights back. Even though we don't have a Mapuche name, they will still help us to be recognized as Mapuche. But nothing has happened. This was back in 2019, and it's 2023 now. But we are still hoping for that and working for that. Another thing is, I think it's important, like in Argentina, for example, we need a DNA bank. So for the future, for our children and for our parents and families in Chile, we need a DNA bank that is handled by the Chilean state, not by, like right now we have to use like, what do you call it, like, yeah, we have to buy DNA tests and from here, from Texas, and send to Chile, and it costs a lot. And we also, so we need, like, we are fighting for access to our own documentation. Like, we need access to our documentation to be able to search for our families and histories, and that is in Chile, and that is in the country where we were adopted, for example, Sweden or Germany. So we need we're working on that. And also, as the biggest thing is we really need to get the illegal adoptions recognized as crime against humanity, because this is what happened. And that is a fight we are trying to do in Chile and in Europe and in other countries too. And we have seen, for example, even though I know, in my case, I know I was kidnapped in Sweden, that is a crime that is, I should have known this before I turned 15, because you have a 15 years of time limitation for crime of being kidnapped. So they need to change the law. And yeah, and I also think we concluded, like, we have also this, we were displaced very far from Chile, and you know, not a lot of people learn Spanish, for example, in school, and Mapuchegun, if we don't even know that you are Mapuche, there's no chance. So that is a little bit about what we are working towards, and it's not easy because it's so many countries involved. It happened in Chile, yes, but we were adopted in other countries. So and the major thing is that a lot of people, thousands of people, they don't even know that they were stolen from their families.
Maybe I can relate to struggles here and in Canada, because I like to name this like we are the stolen generation. Because when there maybe we can talk about 10,000 Mapuche who are internationally in all, I don't know, 80 countries, this is kind of a cleansing. This is kind of an attempt to get one generation, the use of one generation out of the country. And nobody would have thought that these adoptees would search for their roots, would claim their identity, or would like to go back, or are interested in knowing where they're coming from. Because the idea was always, well, they're living in the Western countries, they have everything, so why go back? But there's so much more of being indigenous, of being from country, having another identity. So it's not. It's a very difficult path for us, because I had the chance to go back and to restart my life and to give my life like this change to claim back my indigenous identity, but many can't. We were talking about this because maybe I am one of 10,000 Mapuche who could go back, and well, I'm like a unicorn. It's not. Why is it not possible that the others can go back? Because when you are stolen, when your identity is stolen, a big part of you is missing. A big part of you, I always say that we are kind of a tree. When the roots of the tree aren't there, the tree can't stand strong still when there's wind, when there's a torment. It breaks down. And this is happening to many of adoptees who are not able, because their paperwork is falsified. They cannot go back because there's nowhere where they can go back. I was the lucky one because my parents supported me and my paperwork was almost fine. So I knew where to go back. I always knew that I was Mapuche. So I had a lot of time to get closer to it progressively until I made the decisions to stay there. But it's a struggle. It's like another violation of our rights as Mapuche people, and it's not visibilized. Because yes, we know about the land loss, we know about the language loss, we know about so many things, but that there's a whole generation stolen, abducted in other places of the world. Nobody's talking about this, and we have to change it.
I have some sad news on top of the sad news, which is that we have passed our time. And the good news is that no one's really noticed it because you all have been having an incredible dialogue. So I think, yeah? Okay, well, I was going to say, great. So I was going to say the good news is that the people in the building are going to allow us to have a couple of questions. And I also want to say the good news is that there is a reception, and we want to encourage everybody to stay and take advantage of the opportunity to talk to folks. So we'll take a couple of questions, and then Adela Pineda will have a short closing. Maybe we won't have you all answer, partly, at first at least, let's just collect from around the room.
Hi, hello. My name is Sophia Canawante. I'm a part of ACE in the undergrad department, and I'm also half Mapuche descendant from my side, and it's just been a wonderful experience hearing all of you guys talk about your experience. And I just had a question specifically about identity and indigenous identity, especially because as someone who's half Mapuche descendant, but also Chilean, and also has a father who went through the dictatorship, you know, I'm wondering how the specifics, you know, about that work, I guess.
We take a couple of other questions before we, just to hear them, and then everyone can have a response who wants.
Thank you all so much for that wonderful discussion. I'm curious about the adoption topic. Specifically, I spent some time in Guatemala with some Guatemalan victims of illegal international adoption. I know a lot of them have moved to the stance of calling for the total abolition of international adoption, and I'm wondering your thoughts on that position. Thank you.
Una pregunta para Carola. Las tendencias sobre memoria, hay una memoria de la víctima de violaciones a derechos humanos sin identidad política, que es el desaparecido, la desaparecida, los niños robados. Pero en Chile siempre fue, como en Villa Grimaldi o en Londres 38, la identidad política siempre presente. Hubo un debate en Chile sobre la memoria, de por qué tanta insistencia en la identidad política, o si todos eran víctimas de la dictadura y no era necesario dividir estas identidades políticas.
All right, those were 3 easy questions. I think, why don't we, obviously, Maria and Alina, 2 of those questions were for you all, and then 1 for Carola, but I think, but John hasn't had a chance to talk this last round, so why don't we take them in that order? I mean, and you all can respond to whatever you like. So,
Okay. Mari. Thank you for your question. I think it's, when we talk about our identity, it's like very difficult because, for example, in my case or in Maria's case, we didn't grow up like having like a father or a role model or somebody who could tell us something about our culture, society, spirituality. And even there's a language barrier because I didn't speak Spanish until I was 18, I think. And there was not so much written about Mapuche, so I was kind of like in a vacuum. I didn't know where to go. But I knew that I had to go somewhere. And well, I grew up in Germany, and I solved, in my case, this identity with recovering my language, Mapusungun. And this is kind of the struggle that is keeping me alive, that is giving me strength and a win. And through the language, I can understand slowly my society. I can understand spirituality, and I can, for example, get to know better in the conversation with older people who like to speak more Mapusungun. And when I do have the competence in Mapusungun, I can get to there. So, but it's not that, well, until this age, I'm struggling with my identity and now I'm finished. No, I think it's a constant process. It's a constant process of learning. But I think when you have like the determination and the curiosity, you just go for it. And don't let yourself like getting pulled down by others. You have your idea, you go for it. And go for it with the positivity, with the newen that our ancestors give us.
Yeah, and I'm going to answer your question about adoptions. So before I knew what happened to me and so many others from Chile, I was like, oh, but adoption is something beautiful. It's, you know. But now I would agree with the people you talk to in Guatemala. Like I don't think anyone can guarantee like that adopt like a transnational or transracial adoption that is like totally legal or good for like the children. So I say the same thing. I'm against adoptions today. Yeah.
Sobre la pregunta, yo creo que hay como varias distinciones. Primero, como ponernos en el momento histórico que efectivamente en ese momento en Chile la militancia y la simpatía política era muy común. Estaba mucho más arraigada en el ciudadano de lo que es hoy. Era mucho más fuerte también la discusión, la cultura política desde los sindicatos, las juntas de vecinos, etc. Había un tema político y había un creer en este proyecto que hacía que efectivamente el ciudadano estuviese mucho más involucrado, y de hecho las discusiones y los debates, uno lo puede ver, por ejemplo, en los documentales de Patricio Guzmán, el nivel con el que discutían los trabajadores de esa época. Entonces, un momento de mucha reflexión política, y si bien puede no haber militancia, sí cierta cercanía a los proyectos que se estaban en la mesa en ese momento. Ahora, ¿qué pasa? Lo que yo comentaba es que hay distintos momentos represivos. Y justamente Londres 38 y Villa Grimaldi son de este momento represivo y tienen las características muy parecidas. donde se persigue la militancia. No así tanto el estadio, la época de los estadios donde hablamos de estos cordones industriales, barridas completas y no necesariamente, de verdad, no se le preguntaba específicamente la militancia porque de hecho muchos de ellos no caían por la tortura del anterior. Es un tema bastante delicado, bastante tabú que tiene que ver con la delación en la tortura misma. Entonces ahí son barridos y son en el fondo secuestros más masivos. En Villa Grimaldi no solo el método de tortura, sino la presión, o sea, hubo niños en Villa Grimaldi, o sea, hay un caso muy emblemático que salió hace poco la sentencia, para más años a Krasnov, a propósito de una niña, la Maca Aguiló, que estuvo a los 3, creo, años en Villa Grimaldi para presionar a su padre. Entonces también estamos hablando de una sociedad completa. Acá el terrorismo de Estado es que toda la población sienta temor. Puedo ser militante o no, pero cualquiera puede estar viviendo lo que está pasando en Villa Grimaldi. Puede ser el vecino, puede ser la madre del militante, que no tiene afiliación política. Es más, madres que venían de un sector acomodado cercanas a la derecha, por ejemplo, caso específico del gran actor de Oscar Castro, es su madre, la que desaparece de Villa Grimaldi, es detenida desaparecida. Entonces, no hay una lógica, si bien estos espacios como Villa Grimaldi buscan una persecución a la militancia, por otro lado, no hay una estrategia clara, porque aquí el tema es generar terror, es terrorismo de Estado, y es a cualquiera le puede pasar, y empieza a ocurrir también que el vecino acusa al vecino por lo que escucha, lo que lee, la apariencia. Incluso en el diálogo, en el texto, se habla del compañero, compañera, él probablemente es de este grupo, así que investíguenlo. Entonces empiezan a ocurrir diversas situaciones en la población civil. Yo le comentaba a John, que describe muy bien Manuel Guerrero en su último libro de La sociología de la masacre, cómo toda la sociedad empieza a ser víctima. Pero claro, la especificidad de estos centros tienen que ver con la búsqueda de la militancia.
Gracias, Carola.
Yeah. So this is a topic that I've written about a lot. The militancia política is another way of saying what kind of political action were you involved in, and why did the military government persecute you? And I want to connect it to neoliberalism, so bear with me. You can't understand what happened in the period of the dictatorship or the period of the popular unity unless you understand the political movements. The political movements are collective action in which thousands and thousands of people gather together for common ideals to improve society. That's very different from the neoliberal idea that was imposed by the Constitution, which basically reduces the human person to an individual who acts economically, whose greatest freedom is the freedom to choose one consumer good over another according to how much money you have. So the neoliberal idea of the individual reduces us all to thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of atoms in the world. And the connection between us is only economic. That's very different when you look at a political movement like MIR, which was outside the popular unity, the Communist Party, the Socialist Party. These parties were persecuted because of their political collective action. So you shouldn't look at, I've written about human rights for 50 years now. You shouldn't look at it as an abstract violation of an individual's rights. And it is that, of course, but the greatest crimes are crimes against collectives. Genocide, of course, is the greatest crime, and genocide is defined as the mass killing of people who share an identity, as opposed to being these little atoms that only relate to each other economically. So if you want to understand the enormity of the, well, on one side, the promise of something like the Popular Unity, and on the other side, the great outrage of the military dictatorship, you have to understand the collective organizations that were so active both in those two sides of Chilean society.
Prior to the final words or remarks by Karen and Adela, I just want to express my gratitude towards each of you for being here this evening, for a space of learning and engaging the histories of peoples. This kind of conversation, as you suggest, is part of a larger endeavor for keeping alive the task of building communities of solidarity and love, especially in our times in which across continents we are witnessing to moments of horror and violence against oppressed, colonized peoples. So thank you very much. Chaltumay Mañomeyu.
Bueno, yo en español, un minuto. Cuando Karen y Luis se acercaron al grupo, a Melissa, a Ariel, a mí, para llevar a cabo este evento, pensábamos que la dimensión era difícil porque cada quien iba a invitar a alguien con temas muy diferentes y el formato también se puso a discusión. Hoy día hemos notado que no solo la colaboración de diferentes grupos en la universidad que se dedican y se preocupan por los pueblos de América Latina y por las naciones de América Latina, encuentran su más exacto sentido en el diálogo, porque el formato de este evento, siendo un diálogo entre ustedes que aceptaron venir aquí a compartir con nosotras y nosotros la memoria, el análisis histórico, crítico, la lucha y la militancia y el papel de la ley de una manera tan elocuente y tan consecuente se ve pocas veces. Entonces yo a nombre de Lilas, de nuestra partnership, Lilas Benson, que aquí están estos magníficos archivos, estos testamentos de la historia y como nos convocamos, les doy de verdad muchas gracias.
Reception. Thank you, interpreters.
Okay, I'm gonna put up the original slide and you can all